In 2005, the Price family vanished without a trace from their locked home, leaving behind only questions and a son who would carry the weight of their disappearance for 10 years. When a desperate prisoner offers a cryptic clue about secrets hidden within their family chimney, Ethan Price discovers that sometimes the truth is more terrifying than the mystery itself. What he finds will shatter everything he believed about love, protection, and the people we trust most. This is the story of a family torn apart by a man who believed he was saving them. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. The autumn wind of 2005 carried an unusual bite that October evening, whipping through the bare branches of maple trees lining Elm Street with a ferocity that seemed to mirror the chaos about to unfold. 21-year-old Ethan Price sat hunched over his economics textbook in his cramped dormitory room 300 miles away, the yellow glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across pages filled with supply and demand curves that suddenly seemed meaningless. His coffee had grown cold hours ago, a thin film forming on the surface as he struggled to concentrate on midterm preparations. The heating system in his building rattled and groaned, a constant reminder of the approaching winter that would bring with it the most devastating chapter of his young life. The shrill ring of his cell phone at 11:47 pierced the quiet study session like a knife through silence. Ethan glanced at the caller ID, expecting perhaps his girlfriend Sarah or his roommate calling from the library. Instead, the screen displayed a number he didn't recognize, its harsh blue light illuminating his confused expression. When he answered, the voice on the other end belonged to Officer Patricia Mills of the local police department. Her tone carefully measured yet heavy with the weight of terrible news. The Price family home had been found empty after neighbors reported strange circumstances. All the lights were on, the television was playing, dinner was half prepared on the kitchen counter, but every door and window was locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry, no indications of struggle, no explanation for how an entire family could simply vanish into thin air. Ethan's textbook slipped from his numb fingers, pages fluttering as it hit the linoleum floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo in his suddenly spinning world. The officer's words became distant, muffled, as if spoken through water. His parents, George and Helen Price, along with his sisters Maya and 7-year-old Lily, had disappeared without a trace. The house stood like a monument to interrupted lives. Helen's reading glasses still folded neatly on the coffee table beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. George's work shoes kicked off haphazardly by the front door. Maya's homework spread across the dining room table with her purple pen still uncapped, and Lily's favorite stuffed elephant sitting abandoned on the living room carpet, its button eyes staring at nothing. The 6-hour drive home through the night felt like a descent into a waking nightmare. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel of his beat-up Honda Civic until his knuckles turned white, the highway stretching endlessly before him under a moonless sky. Rain began to fall somewhere outside of Columbus, each drop striking his windshield like accusatory fingers. The radio played mindless late-night talk shows that he couldn't bear to listen to. So he drove in suffocating silence, his mind racing with possibilities that grew more horrifying with each passing mile marker. Had he been a better son? Would he have been home that night? Could his presence have prevented whatever happened? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, eating away at his sanity. Detective Olivia Reyes was waiting for him when he arrived at the family home just as dawn was breaking. Her dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail that accentuated the sharp angles of her face. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of her surroundings. Yellow police tape fluttered across the front porch like macabre party decorations, and the sight of it made Ethan's stomach lurch violently. The detective's handshake was firm, professional, but her eyes held a warmth that suggested genuine concern rather than mere duty. Walking through his childhood home felt like touring a museum of his own life. Everything was exactly as his family had left it, yet nothing felt familiar anymore. The house had become a crime scene, each room cordoned off and photographed, every surface dusted for fingerprints that would never be found. In the kitchen, his mother's famous lasagna sat half-assembled in its baking dish, the ricotta cheese now curdled and discolored. The dining room table was set for 5, as it had been every night for as long as Ethan could remember. But now the empty chairs seemed to mock the very concept of family dinners. Lily's coloring books lay scattered across her bedroom floor, crayons broken and abandoned mid-masterpiece, and Maya's teenage rebellion was frozen in time. Band posters covering every inch of her walls, clothes strewn across furniture with the casual disorder of youth. The investigation consumed the following weeks like a voracious beast. Detective Reyes questioned neighbors who had seen nothing unusual, interviewed George's business associates who claimed ignorance of any troubles, and combed through financial records that revealed nothing more suspicious than a family living slightly beyond their means. The media descended upon the quiet suburban neighborhood like vultures, their news vans lining the street, and reporters shoving microphones into the faces of anyone willing to comment on the mysterious disappearance of the Price family. Ethan found himself thrust into an unwanted spotlight, his grief becoming public property as cameras followed him to and from the police station. As days turned to weeks, the initial urgency of the investigation began to wane. Leads dried up like autumn leaves, and the case file grew thicker with dead ends and unanswered questions. The prevailing theory among investigators became increasingly uncomfortable for Ethan to accept: that his father had somehow engineered the family's disappearance, perhaps fleeing from debts or legal troubles that had never come to light. The idea that George Price, the man who had coached Little League and never missed a parent-teacher conference, could orchestrate such an elaborate deception seemed impossible. Yet as evidence failed to materialize, it became the most logical explanation for the inexplicable. 10 years passed like a slow-motion nightmare. Ethan graduated from college with honors he felt he didn't deserve, pursued a career in journalism that felt hollow, without family to share his successes, and maintained relationships that inevitably crumbled under the weight of his unresolved trauma. He moved back to his childhood home, unable to sell the property, but unwilling to let strangers inhabit the spaces where his family's laughter once echoed. The house became his prison and his sanctuary, every creak of the floorboards a potential message from the past, every shadow a possible glimpse of what had been lost. The guilt consumed him like a slow-acting poison. In quiet moments, when the world grew still and his defenses were down, Ethan tortured himself with alternate histories. If he had come home that weekend as originally planned instead of staying at school to study, would his presence have changed everything? Could he have protected them, warned them, or at the very least shared their fate rather than being condemned to survive as the sole witness to their absence? The rational part of his mind knew these thoughts were destructive, but rationality had little power against the crushing weight of survivor's guilt that pressed down on him like a physical force. Then, on a gray October morning exactly 10 years after that terrible night, hope arrived in the most unlikely package. Marco Diaz sat shackled to a metal table in the county courthouse, his weathered face bearing the marks of a life lived on society's margins. The small-time drug dealer had been arrested for possession, with intent to distribute, a charge that would likely put him away for the next decade of his life. But Marco had information to trade, and the desperation in his eyes suggested he was willing to bargain with whatever currency he possessed. Detective Reyes, now bearing the lines and gray streaks that 10 years of unsolved cases had carved into her features, sat across from the prisoner with barely contained skepticism. She had heard countless lies from countless criminals over the years, each one promising the breakthrough that would crack open cold cases in exchange for reduced sentences. But when Marco mentioned the Price family, something in his voice made her lean forward despite herself. The truth, Marco claimed, was hidden where no one had thought to look, inside the very heart of the family home, concealed within the brick chimney that had warmed countless winter evenings and witnessed years of holiday gatherings. He couldn't say what was hidden there, only that his former associate had mentioned it during a drug-fueled confession years earlier. The associate was dead now, killed in a prison fight, taking his secrets with him to the grave. But the chimney remained, holding its secrets like a guardian of the past, waiting for someone brave enough to disturb its silence and uncover the truth that had been hidden in plain sight for a decade. The morning mist clung to the Price family home like ghostly fingers reluctant to let go of the past, creating an ethereal atmosphere that seemed to blur the line between memory and reality. Detective Olivia Reyes stood on the front porch, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp October air as she fumbled with the keys that had remained untouched for months. Beside her, Ethan shifted nervously from foot to foot, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his worn leather jacket. The weight of anticipation pressed down on both of them like a physical force, heavy with the possibility that after 10 years of silence, the house might finally surrender its secrets. The front door opened with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo through the empty corridors like a sigh of resignation. Dust motes danced in the pale sunlight that filtered through unwashed windows, creating patterns that shifted and swirled with each movement. The air inside was stale and cold, carrying the faint scent of old wood and forgotten memories. Ethan's footsteps on the hardwood floor sounded unnaturally loud in the silence, each step a reminder of how different this house felt without the warm chaos of family life filling its rooms. The living room remained exactly as it had been left that terrible night a decade ago, preserved like a museum exhibit of interrupted lives. Lily's stuffed elephant still sat on the carpet, its once bright purple fur now faded and covered with a fine layer of dust. Maya's textbooks lay scattered across the coffee table, their pages yellowed with age and neglect. The family portrait on the mantelpiece watched over the scene with frozen smiles, 5 faces captured in a moment of happiness that now seemed to belong to another lifetime entirely. Detective Reyes moved with practiced efficiency toward the fireplace, her trained eyes scanning every detail of the brick structure that had warmed countless family gatherings. The chimney rose majestically from floor to ceiling, its red bricks darkened by years of use and bearing the subtle stains of smoke and soot. She ran her fingers along the mortar lines, feeling for any irregularities that might indicate tampering or hidden compartments. The bricks felt cold and solid under her touch, revealing nothing of the secrets they might harbor within their ancient embrace. Ethan watched with growing anxiety as the detective began a methodical examination of the hearth. His heart hammered against his ribs with such force that he wondered if she could hear it in the oppressive silence of the room. Every few seconds, he found himself holding his breath, waiting for some sign, some indication that Marco Diaz had been telling the truth. The possibility that this might be another dead end, another false hope in a decade of disappointments, gnawed at his stomach like acid. The breakthrough came when Detective Reyes noticed a subtle difference in the coloration of one section of bricks, about 4 feet up from the hearth floor. The mortar around a cluster of 6 bricks appeared slightly newer than the surrounding areas, as if it had been removed and replaced at some point. Using a small chisel from her evidence kit, she began to carefully work at the edges of the suspicious bricks, her movements precise and deliberate. Flakes of mortar fell to the hearth like snow, each fragment representing another barrier between them and the truth. The first brick came loose with surprising ease, revealing a dark hollow space behind it that seemed to swallow the beam of Detective Reyes's flashlight. The musty smell of confined air escaped from the opening, carrying with it the weight of years and secrets. As more bricks were carefully removed, the hollow space revealed itself to be a deliberately constructed hiding place, perfectly sized to conceal objects of significant importance. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as Detective Reyes reached into the dark space and withdrew a metal box, its surface green with age and corrosion but still intact. The container was roughly the size of a shoebox, heavy enough to suggest substantial contents, and sealed with multiple layers of plastic wrap that had protected it from moisture and decay. The detective placed it reverently on the coffee table, treating it like the precious artifact it had become after 10 years of concealment. With surgical precision, Detective Reyes cut through the plastic wrapping, each layer peeling away to reveal the metal surface beneath. The box itself was a simple fireproof document container, the kind used by cautious individuals to protect important papers from disaster. There was no lock, just a simple latch mechanism that opened with a soft click that seemed to reverberate through the room like a gunshot. The contents of the box were neatly organized, as if George Price had known that someday someone would need to understand the story they told. Manila folders contained photocopied documents, bank statements showing irregular transfers of large sums of money, and correspondence that revealed the intricate web of financial deception that had apparently consumed the final months of George's life. Beneath the papers lay a small digital recorder, its red plastic casing scratched and worn but still functional after its decade-long imprisonment. Detective Reyes handled each document with the care of an archaeologist examining ancient artifacts. But it was the recorder that drew their immediate attention. The device seemed to pulse with possibility, holding within its electronic memory the voice of a dead man and the secrets that had died with him. Ethan's hands trembled as he reached for it, his fingers hesitating just inches from the plastic surface, as if touching it might somehow make the past 10 years disappear, or, conversely, make the pain even more unbearable. The detective nodded her encouragement, understanding instinctively that this moment belonged to Ethan, that he needed to be the one to press play and bridge the gap between past and present. The small device felt surprisingly warm in his palm, as if it had been waiting all these years for his touch. The play button yielded to gentle pressure, and after a moment of electronic silence, the room filled with a voice that Ethan had thought he would never hear again. George Price's voice emerged from the tiny speaker like a ghost materializing from the ether, instantly recognizable despite the distortion of fear and desperation that colored every word. The sound hit Ethan with the force of a physical blow, causing him to sink into the familiar embrace of his father's old recliner, as tears he had held back for a decade finally broke free. The voice was exactly as he remembered it, warm and familiar, yet now carrying undertones of terror and regret that made each word a knife twist in his heart. The recording began with the sound of George clearing his throat nervously, followed by the rustle of papers and the distant tick of the grandfather clock that had stood in the hallway for as long as Ethan could remember. When his father finally began to speak, the words tumbled out in a rush of confession and desperation. He spoke of Julian Croft, his business partner and friend, whose charm and apparent success had masked a web of illegal financial schemes that had gradually ensnared George like quicksand. The details emerged in fragments, painted in George's trembling voice like brushstrokes of a nightmare. Real estate deals that existed only on paper, mortgage applications filled with false information, loan documents bearing forged signatures, and bank accounts that moved money through elaborate shell games designed to confuse auditors and hide the truth from legitimate authorities. George's voice cracked as he described how Julian had initially presented these activities as minor ethical shortcuts, ways to help struggling families achieve homeownership dreams that would otherwise remain forever out of reach. But the scope of the operation had grown beyond anything George had imagined or consented to participate in. Millions of dollars were being laundered through their real estate company, money that Julian claimed came from overseas investors, but which George had begun to suspect originated from far darker sources. The evidence was mounting that Julian Croft was not simply a corrupt businessman, but a facilitator for organized crime, using their legitimate real estate operation as a front for money laundering and fraud on a massive scale. George's voice became increasingly agitated as he described his growing awareness of the true nature of their business partnership. Late-night meetings with men whose faces he was not allowed to see, briefcases full of cash that appeared and disappeared without explanation, and Julian's gradual transformation from trusted friend to something far more sinister and controlling. The realization that he had become complicit in crimes that could destroy not only his own life, but the lives of his innocent family members, had driven George to the breaking point. The recording captured the moment of George's decision to break free from Julian's web, his voice gaining strength and resolve as he described his plan to gather evidence and present it to federal authorities. He had spent weeks secretly copying documents, photographing financial records, and building a case that would expose the full scope of the criminal enterprise. But Julian was becoming suspicious, asking probing questions about George's activities, and watching him with the calculating eyes of a predator who sensed betrayal among his prey. The terror in George's voice was palpable, as he described the growing certainty that Julian had discovered his plans. Strange cars had begun appearing in their neighborhood. Phone calls came at odd hours with no one speaking when answered, and Julian's demeanor had shifted from friendly manipulation to barely concealed menace. George knew that time was running out, that he had perhaps days or even hours before Julian would move to protect himself and silence the threat that George represented. The recording ended with George's desperate plea to whoever might eventually find his hidden evidence. His voice broke with emotion as he spoke directly to his family, apologizing for the danger his choices had brought upon them, and expressing his love for Helen, Maya, Lily, and Ethan, with the intensity of a man who knew he might never have another chance to say these words. If someone was listening to this recording, he explained through tears, it meant that his worst fears had come to pass, and that Julian Croft had succeeded in silencing him before he could expose the truth. The silence that followed the end of the recording was deafening, broken only by the sound of Ethan's ragged breathing and the distant hum of traffic from the street outside. Detective Reyes sat motionless, her professional composure cracked by the raw emotion and desperate honesty of George Price's final message. The weight of 10 years of questions had been replaced by the even heavier burden of terrible knowledge, and both of them understood that this recording had changed everything, while simultaneously explaining nothing about what had actually happened to the Price family. The gleaming towers of downtown's financial district stretched toward the overcast sky like monuments to ambition and power, their glass facades reflecting the gray autumn clouds that had gathered throughout the morning. Detective Reyes adjusted her rearview mirror for the third time in 5 minutes, her nervous energy betraying the calm professionalism she typically maintained during investigations. Beside her in the passenger seat, Ethan sat rigid with tension, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out like steel cables beneath his skin. The address they had traced for Julian Croft led them to the 32nd floor of the city's most prestigious office building, a location that seemed impossibly far removed from the criminal underworld described in George Price's desperate recording. The elevator ride to Julian's floor felt interminable, each floor they passed marked by a soft ding that seemed to count down to an inevitable confrontation. Ethan's reflection stared back at him from the polished steel doors, his face pale and drawn with the weight of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. Detective Reyes checked her service weapon one final time, her fingers moving with the unconscious precision of years of training, though both of them understood that whatever awaited them upstairs would likely be far more complex than any situation that could be resolved with handcuffs and Miranda rights. The offices of Croft Development occupied an entire floor of the building, their entrance marked by elegant brass lettering that spoke of success and legitimacy. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, the cityscape spread out below like a three-dimensional map, with tiny cars and pedestrians moving through their daily routines, completely unaware of the drama unfolding high above their heads. The reception area was appointed with the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about wealth, from the hand-selected marble surfaces to the original artwork that adorned the walls with splashes of color and sophistication. Julian Croft's personal secretary was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair pulled back in an immaculate chignon, and the kind of polished competence that came from decades of managing the complex schedules of powerful men. She regarded Detective Reyes's badge with the practiced calm of someone who had likely dealt with law enforcement visits before, though a slight tightening around her eyes suggested that such encounters were neither welcome nor routine. Her manicured fingers moved across her computer keyboard with swift efficiency as she announced their arrival through her headset, her voice maintaining the perfect balance of professionalism and subtle protective warning. The wait in the reception area stretched for nearly 20 minutes, a psychological tactic that both Ethan and Detective Reyes recognized but were powerless to counter. They sat on leather chairs that probably cost more than most people earned in a month, surrounded by the quiet hum of expensive electronics and the subtle fragrance of fresh flowers that were undoubtedly replaced daily. Business magazines fanned across glass tables featured headlines about market trends and corporate mergers, the mundane concerns of legitimate commerce that seemed to mock the dark purpose of their visit. When Julian Croft finally emerged from his inner office, the impact was immediate and unsettling. He was not the shadowy criminal figure that Ethan had constructed in his imagination during the long years of wondering about his family's fate. Instead, Julian appeared to be everything that American business culture celebrated. Tall and commanding in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, with silver-touched hair that suggested distinguished maturity, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to assess and catalog everything they encountered. His handshake was firm without being aggressive, his smile warm enough to seem genuine while remaining carefully measured. The office beyond the reception area was a testament to Julian's apparent success and sophisticated taste. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined one wall, filled with leather-bound volumes on finance, philosophy, and art history that showed signs of actual reading rather than mere decoration. Original paintings by recognizable masters adorned the walls, while a corner of the office housed an antique chess set carved from what appeared to be ivory and ebony. The massive desk was crafted from a single piece of polished walnut, its surface organized with the precision of a mind that valued control and attention to detail above all else. Julian settled behind his desk with the easy confidence of a man who had conducted thousands of such meetings, his movements economical and purposeful. He folded his hands on the desktop and regarded his visitors with an expression that managed to convey polite interest while revealing nothing of his inner thoughts. Detective Reyes began with the standard questions about George Price and their business relationship, but Julian's responses were smoothly evasive, acknowledging past associations while carefully avoiding any admission of wrongdoing or detailed knowledge of George's final days. As the questioning continued, Ethan found himself studying Julian's face for any sign of the monster described in his father's recording. But Julian's demeanor remained impeccably civilized, even sympathetic, as he expressed apparent regret about the Price family's disappearance and offered vague condolences for Ethan's decade of uncertainty. There was something deeply unsettling about this disconnect between expectation and reality, as if Julian existed in two different worlds simultaneously without any apparent internal conflict. The meeting concluded with Julian providing contact information for his attorneys and expressing his willingness to cooperate with any official investigation, his tone suggesting the weary patience of a successful man who had dealt with various accusations and inquiries throughout his career. Detective Reyes gathered her notes with professional efficiency, but Ethan could sense her frustration with Julian's smooth deflection of their questions. As they prepared to leave, Julian rose from his desk and approached Ethan with what seemed like genuine concern, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture that felt both comforting and vaguely threatening. The elevator ride down to the lobby was conducted in silence, both Ethan and Detective Reyes processing their encounter with the man who had somehow transformed from criminal mastermind into legitimate businessman. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, challenging everything they had assumed about Julian's role in the Price family's disappearance. Outside on the sidewalk, Detective Reyes finally voiced what they both were thinking: that Julian Croft was either innocent of the crimes described in George's recording, or he was a far more sophisticated and dangerous adversary than they had imagined. That evening, as Ethan sat in his father's old recliner trying to process the day's events, his cell phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. The voice that greeted him when he answered was immediately familiar from their earlier meeting, Julian's distinctive baritone carrying easily across the electronic connection. There was no preamble, no social pleasantries, just a direct statement that cut through Ethan's defenses like a surgical blade through flesh. Julian's words reordered reality with the devastating efficiency of an earthquake, revealing that everything Ethan had believed about his family's fate was simultaneously wrong and more complex than he could have imagined. His family was alive, Julian explained in a tone that mixed paternal warmth with unmistakable authority. They had been relocated and provided with new identities, living comfortable lives under Julian's protection, rather than suffering as victims of his criminal activities. The disappearance had not been a kidnapping in the traditional sense, but rather a necessary evacuation from dangers that George's naive attempts at whistleblowing had unleashed. The explanation flowed from Julian's lips with the practiced smoothness of a story that had been refined through years of internal justification. George's plan to expose their business arrangement had attracted the attention of far more dangerous individuals than Julian himself. Criminal organizations that viewed betrayal as a capital offense and had no qualms about eliminating entire families to send appropriate messages. Julian's decision to relocate the Price family had been an act of protection rather than aggression, a chess move designed to remove them from the board before more ruthless players could claim them as casualties. As Julian spoke, Ethan heard the soft sound of photographs being transmitted to his phone, digital images that materialized on his screen like messages from another dimension. The first photo showed his mother Helen sitting in what appeared to be a garden cafe, her hair styled differently than he remembered, but her face bearing the same gentle expression he had carried in his memory for 10 years. She appeared healthy, perhaps even content, reading a book while sunlight filtered through the cafe's windows to illuminate her features with golden warmth. The second photograph captured Maya, now in her late 20s rather than the teenager he remembered, walking through what looked like a college campus with an armload of books. Her appearance had matured dramatically, but her distinctive laugh lines and the determined set of her shoulders were unmistakably familiar. She wore professional attire that suggested a career in academia or business, and her stride conveyed the confidence of a woman who had successfully navigated the transition from adolescence to adulthood. But it was the third photograph that drove the knife of emotion deepest into Ethan's heart. Lily, no longer the 7-year-old child who had disappeared but now a teenager of 17, stood beside a swimming pool wearing a high school varsity jacket and holding what appeared to be a medal or trophy. Her face had lost the round softness of early childhood and taken on the angular beauty of approaching womanhood. But her eyes still held the same spark of curiosity and intelligence that had made her such a delight to be around. Julian allowed the impact of these images to settle before continuing his explanation, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the psychological devastation he was inflicting. The choice he presented to Ethan was elegantly simple in its cruelty. Abandon his search for the truth and allow his family to continue their peaceful existence under Julian's protection, or persist in his investigation, and risk destroying the safety and stability that had sheltered them for the past decade. The photographs on Ethan's phone screen seemed to pulse with life and possibility, evidence that his deepest fears had been unfounded, but also proof of how completely his family's lives had been transformed without his knowledge or consent. They had grown and changed and created new identities while he had remained frozen in the moment of their disappearance, a temporal prisoner serving a sentence of perpetual grief for crimes he had not committed. Julian's final words carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, mixed with what seemed like genuine concern for the consequences of the wrong choice. He understood, he said, that Ethan's desire for reunification was natural and powerful, but sometimes love required sacrifice, and sometimes protection meant accepting painful separation. The decision was Ethan's to make, but Julian wanted him to understand that this choice would determine not only Ethan's future, but the fate of 3 women who had built new lives from the ashes of their old ones and deserved the chance to continue living them in peace. The phone line went dead, leaving Ethan alone with the photographs and the impossible weight of a decision that felt like choosing between his own salvation and his family's survival. The sleepless nights that followed Julian's revelation blurred together like watercolors in rain, each one marked by Ethan's obsessive research into the man who claimed to be his family's protector. The blue glow of his laptop screen had become a constant companion, illuminating his increasingly gaunt features as he scrolled through public records, newspaper archives, and social media profiles in search of answers that seemed to retreat further with each discovery. His coffee table had transformed into a command center of printed documents, sticky notes, and photographs that mapped out Julian Croft's life like a detective's murder board, each connection drawn in red ink that seemed to pulse with urgency under the harsh light of his desk lamp. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, buried in the archives of a small-town newspaper from 15 years earlier. The headline was modest, relegated to the second page of local news: "Local family missing after house fire." But the accompanying photograph made Ethan's breath catch in his throat like a physical blow. A younger Julian Croft stood beside the charred remains of what had once been an elegant suburban home, his face contorted with grief that seemed to radiate from the grainy newsprint like heat from a forge. The caption identified him as the husband and father of the missing family, Rebecca Croft, age 34, and their 2 children, Samuel, age 12, and Emma, age 8. The article painted a picture of tragedy that felt eerily familiar to Ethan's own experience. The Croft family had vanished without explanation on a winter evening, their house discovered engulfed in flames that had consumed any evidence of what might have happened to them. Julian had been traveling on business, providing him with an airtight alibi, but also condemning him to the same torment of unanswered questions that had consumed Ethan for the past decade. The investigation had eventually concluded that the family had perished in the fire, though no bodies were ever recovered from the ashes and debris. Further digging revealed the darker context behind the Croft family's disappearance. Julian's construction company had been under investigation for money laundering and bid rigging, activities that had apparently attracted the attention of organized crime figures who viewed Julian as either a valuable asset or a dangerous liability. The timing of the family's disappearance, just days before Julian was scheduled to testify before a federal grand jury, suggested that his loved ones had become pawns in a game of intimidation and control that had ultimately claimed their lives. The psychological profile that emerged from Ethan's research painted Julian not as a cold-blooded criminal mastermind, but as a man whose moral compass had been shattered by unbearable loss. The legitimate businessman who had once coached Little League baseball and donated generously to local charities had been replaced by someone willing to cross any ethical boundary if it meant preventing other families from suffering the same fate as his own. His descent into the criminal underworld had been gradual but inevitable, each compromise justified as a necessary step toward accumulating the power and resources needed to protect the innocent from the monsters who had destroyed his world. The revelation transformed Julian from a simple antagonist into something far more complex and disturbing. A broken man whose love had been twisted into obsession, whose protective instincts had metastasized into controlling behavior that held his victims captive while convincing himself that he was saving them. The Price family had become Julian's second chance at redemption, a living substitute for the wife and children he had failed to protect, and their forced disappearance was his attempt to write a different ending to the same tragic story. Armed with this new understanding, Ethan began to see patterns in Julian's behavior that had previously seemed like calculated cruelty, but now revealed themselves as the desperate actions of a man trying to prevent history from repeating itself. The elaborate security measures, the false identities, the complete severance from their previous lives, these were not punishments, but Julian's version of love, expressed through the only means his trauma-damaged psyche could comprehend. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on Ethan like a physical burden, making it difficult to breathe as he processed the implications of Julian's psychological state. If Julian truly believed he was protecting the Price family from the same fate that had befallen his own loved ones, then any attempt to rescue them would be perceived not as liberation, but as a threat that needed to be eliminated. The man who held Ethan's family was not motivated by greed or power, but by a love so damaged and desperate that it had become indistinguishable from madness. It was during one of these sleepless nights of research and anguish that Ethan's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief and cryptic, containing only an address and a time, but something in the phrasing triggered a memory so powerful that his hands began to shake. The writing style, with its careful grammar and distinctive punctuation, reminded him of the notes Maya used to leave for him when they were children. Little messages passed between siblings who shared a private language of inside jokes and subtle references. The meeting location was a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place that catered to shift workers and insomniacs with its harsh fluorescent lighting and vinyl booths that had seen better decades. Ethan arrived early, his nerves stretched to the breaking point as he nursed a cup of coffee that had gone cold long before he remembered to drink it. The diner was nearly empty except for a lone truck driver hunched over a plate of eggs at the counter and a waitress who moved through her routine with the mechanical efficiency of someone working the graveyard shift. When Maya finally entered, the recognition was immediate despite the passage of 10 years and the dramatic changes that time and circumstance had wrought upon her features. She had grown into the beautiful woman that her teenage promise had suggested, but her eyes carried a weight of experience and pain that made her appear older than her 28 years. She moved with the cautious awareness of someone who had learned to constantly monitor her surroundings, her gaze sweeping the diner's interior before settling on Ethan with a mixture of joy and terror that threatened to break his heart. The woman who slid into the booth across from him bore little resemblance to the carefree teenager he remembered, yet something in her smile transported him instantly back to their childhood home and the comfortable familiarity of sibling relationships that transcended time and trauma. She wore simple clothes that suggested a middle-class lifestyle, her hair styled in a way that complemented her features, while remaining understated enough to avoid drawing unwanted attention. But it was her hands that revealed the true story of her existence. They trembled slightly as she folded them on the table, and he could see the pale marks on her wrists where jewelry or restraints had left permanent impressions on her skin. Maya's presence in the diner felt both miraculous and terrifying, a living bridge between Ethan's memories of his lost family and the harsh reality of their current situation. She explained in whispered tones how she had managed to slip away from their carefully monitored existence, using skills of deception and misdirection that she had been forced to develop over years of subtle rebellion against Julian's suffocating control. The meeting was a tremendous risk for her, one that could result in punishment not just for herself but for their mother and Lily as well. Yet her desperate need to reconnect with the brother she had lost had finally overcome her fear. The story Maya told painted a picture of captivity that was all the more horrifying for its veneer of normalcy and care. Julian had indeed provided them with comfortable lives, complete with quality education, health care, and material possessions that suggested affluence rather than imprisonment. But every aspect of their existence was carefully controlled and monitored, from the books they were allowed to read to the people they were permitted to interact with, all justified through Julian's gentle but implacable insistence that the outside world remained too dangerous for them to navigate safely. The psychological warfare Julian employed was sophisticated and relentless, designed to gradually erode their connection to their previous identities, while replacing those memories with a new narrative that positioned him as their savior rather than their captor. Helen had struggled the longest to maintain her sense of self, clinging desperately to memories of George and their life before the disappearance. But years of isolation and Julian's patient manipulation had worn down her resistance until she existed in a state of confused compliance that broke Maya's heart to witness. But it was the situation with Lily that represented Julian's greatest success and Maya's deepest source of anguish. The 7-year-old child who had disappeared that night had been gradually transformed into someone who genuinely believed that Julian was her father, that their current life was the only one she'd ever known, and that the occasional fragments of memory that surfaced from her subconscious were nothing more than the products of an overactive imagination. Julian had accomplished this transformation through a combination of gentle patience and subtle psychological conditioning, replacing her real memories with manufactured ones so skillfully that even Maya sometimes doubted her own recollections of their previous life. The most heartbreaking aspect of Lily's transformation was her genuine affection for Julian, who had positioned himself as the loving patriarch of their reconstructed family unit. She called him Daddy with the natural ease of a child who had never known any other father, and her face would light up when he returned from his business trips bearing gifts and stories of the dangerous world from which he protected them. Maya's attempts to preserve Lily's true memories had become increasingly desperate and dangerous, conducted in whispered conversations when Julian's surveillance was at its weakest. But even these efforts seemed to be failing as Lily grew older and more completely integrated into the false reality Julian had constructed around them. The weight of maintaining this resistance had taken its toll on Maya, who existed in a constant state of hypervigilance and emotional exhaustion. She served as the keeper of their family's true history, carrying the burden of memories that she could never fully share with her mother and sister without risking Julian's wrath. Every day brought new challenges to her sanity and resolve, as she watched the people she loved most gradually disappear into the roles Julian had assigned them, leaving her increasingly isolated in her knowledge of who they really were and what they had lost. Maya's eyes filled with tears as she described the elaborate performances required to maintain the facade of their happiness, the way Julian would orchestrate family gatherings and celebrations that appeared warm and loving from the outside, but felt hollow and artificial to those who remembered what genuine family connection actually felt like. She had become an expert at reading Julian's moods and anticipating his expectations, understanding that their continued safety depended on her ability to convincingly portray contentment with their circumstances, while secretly nurturing the spark of rebellion that kept her true self alive. The meeting in the diner lasted only 20 minutes, but in that brief time Maya managed to convey the full complexity and horror of their situation with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this conversation countless times in her mind. As she prepared to leave, slipping back into the carefully constructed persona that would allow her to return undetected to their gilded cage, she pressed a small piece of paper into Ethan's hand, containing information that would change everything. The location where they were being held, and Julian's greatest vulnerability that might finally provide the key to their liberation. The federal task force assembled in the pre-dawn darkness, like a precision instrument designed for the singular purpose of dismantling Julian Croft's carefully constructed empire. Detective Reyes stood among the sea of dark windbreakers emblazoned with FBI lettering, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid October air as she reviewed the tactical plans that had consumed the past 72 hours. The evidence from George Price's hidden cache had proven more devastating than anyone had anticipated, revealing connections that stretched from local real estate fraud to international money laundering operations that had funneled millions of dollars through seemingly legitimate businesses for over a decade. The documents had been like dominoes falling in sequence, each revelation triggering the next until the full scope of Julian's criminal network lay exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the federal building's war room. Bank records showed suspicious transfers between dozens of shell companies. Construction contracts revealed systematic overbilling and materials fraud. And most damning of all, encrypted communications intercepted from Julian's personal devices had laid bare the intricate web of corruption that reached into City Hall, the courthouse, and even the police department itself. Ethan sat in the back of an unmarked surveillance van, his hands clenched so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had turned white against the darkness. The armored vehicle hummed with electronic equipment that painted the target location in green-tinted detail on multiple screens, showing the Georgian mansion that had served as his family's prison for the past 10 years. The house sat on 12 acres of manicured grounds, surrounded by walls that had been designed to look decorative, but were topped with sophisticated security sensors that could detect movement from hundreds of yards away. The mansion itself was a monument to Julian's success and his psychological need for control, its symmetrical facade suggesting order and stability, while concealing the complex surveillance systems that monitored every room and corridor within its walls. Thermal imaging revealed the locations of the building's occupants, 4 heat signatures moving through the structure in patterns that suggested the routine of a normal morning despite the extraordinary circumstances that were about to unfold. Agent Sarah Chen, the FBI's lead negotiator, adjusted her headset as she reviewed the psychological profile that had been hastily assembled from Ethan's research and Maya's intelligence. Julian Croft was not a typical hostage-taker, and the situation required a delicate approach that acknowledged the twisted paternal relationship he had developed with his captives. Any aggressive action that threatened his carefully constructed family dynamic could trigger a violent response that would endanger the very people they were trying to save. The first phase of the operation began with the systematic dismantling of Julian's financial empire, as federal agents simultaneously executed search warrants on 17 different locations across the city. Construction sites were shut down, bank accounts were frozen, and key associates were arrested in a coordinated sweep that had been planned with military precision. The goal was to strip away Julian's resources and support network, while demonstrating the futility of resistance, creating psychological pressure that would force him to negotiate rather than fight. Julian's response came faster than anticipated, his phone call to Agent Chen arriving just as the last of his business locations was being secured by federal agents. His voice carried the calm authority of a man accustomed to navigating crises, but there was an underlying tremor of desperation that suggested his composure was beginning to crack under the pressure of his collapsing world. He requested a face-to-face meeting with Ethan, claiming that he had information about higher-level criminal figures that would be worth substantial prosecutorial consideration. The negotiation that followed played out over several hours, with Julian demonstrating the same tactical sophistication that had kept him ahead of law enforcement for over a decade. He understood that his only remaining asset was his knowledge of the criminal network that had originally threatened his own family, and he wielded that information like a skilled poker player holding the last good hand in a game where the stakes were measured in human lives rather than money. As the tactical teams positioned themselves around the mansion's perimeter, Ethan found himself walking up the familiar stone pathway that led to his family's prison, every step bringing him closer to a reunion that felt more like a funeral than a celebration. The house loomed before him, its windows glowing warmly in the afternoon light, creating an illusion of domestic tranquility that made the surrounding army of federal agents seem surreal and intrusive. Julian met him at the front door, dressed in casual clothes that suggested he had been enjoying a peaceful weekend at home rather than orchestrating one of the most complex hostage situations in recent memory. His appearance was perfectly composed, from his carefully styled hair to his pressed khakis and polo shirt. But his eyes held the feverish intensity of a man whose carefully constructed world was disintegrating around him with each passing moment. The interior of the mansion was even more unsettling than Ethan had imagined, decorated with a combination of luxury and surveillance technology that created an atmosphere of comfortable imprisonment. Family photographs lined the hallways, showing images of holidays and celebrations that had been staged to create the illusion of happiness, while documenting Julian's success in replacing Ethan with himself as the patriarch of the Price family. The living room where their confrontation took place was dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the grounds, while also serving as a constant reminder of the isolation that had defined his family's existence for the past decade. Julian settled into a leather armchair, with the casual confidence of a host entertaining a welcome guest, while Ethan remained standing near the doorway, his body tense with the conflicting impulses to flee and to search every room until he found his family. Julian's words flowed with the practiced smoothness of someone who had spent years justifying his actions to himself, creating a narrative in which every decision had been motivated by love and necessity, rather than obsession and control. He spoke of the genuine threats that had existed when he first relocated the Price family, providing detailed accounts of the criminal figures who had viewed George's planned testimony as an existential threat to their operations. The protection he had offered had been real, Julian insisted, even if the methods had been extreme. But as his monologue continued, the true depth of Julian's psychological damage became increasingly apparent. He spoke of Helen, Maya, and Lily, not as hostages who had been taken against their will, but as beloved family members who had been rescued from a dangerous world and given the gift of safety and stability. The decade of captivity was reframed as a decade of protection, and Ethan's arrival was portrayed as a selfish intrusion that threatened to destroy the peaceful life that Julian had worked so hard to create. The most disturbing aspect of Julian's presentation was his genuine belief in the righteousness of his actions. He had convinced himself that the Price family was better off under his care than they would have been in the outside world, that his love and protection were superior to the chaos and uncertainty of their previous existence. When he spoke of Lily calling him daddy, His face glowed with paternal pride that would have been touching in any other context, but felt horrifying given the circumstances. The sound of footsteps on the staircase interrupted Julian's monologue, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat as his family appeared in the living room doorway. Helen looked older than her years, her face bearing the subtle signs of prolonged stress despite her carefully maintained appearance. Maya's eyes met Ethan's with a mixture of hope and terror, while Lily hung back behind Julian's chair with the wariness of a child who had learned to read the emotional temperature of adult situations with survival-dependent accuracy. The reunion that Ethan had dreamed of for 10 years unfolded with none of the joy he had imagined, and all of the complex trauma he had feared. Helen's recognition was immediate but confused, as if she were seeing a ghost from a life she could barely remember. Maya stepped forward with tears streaming down her face, but her relief was tempered by the visible fear of Julian's reaction to their display of emotion. But it was Lily's response that drove the deepest wound into Ethan's heart. The 17-year-old who stood before him bore little resemblance to the 7-year-old sister he remembered, and when she looked at him, there was no recognition in her eyes, only the polite curiosity of a teenager being introduced to a stranger. Julian had succeeded in erasing Ethan from her memory so completely that his presence in their home felt like an invasion rather than a homecoming. The federal agents who entered the house moments later moved with the efficient professionalism of a well-rehearsed operation, but their presence transformed the space from a family home into a crime scene with devastating finality. Julian's arrest was conducted with minimal drama, his surrender as composed and dignified as everything else about his carefully maintained facade. But as the handcuffs clicked into place, his mask finally slipped, revealing the broken man whose love had metastasized into something unrecognizable. The evacuation of the mansion proceeded with medical precision, as psychologists and social workers began the complex process of assessing the mental state of 3 women who had spent a decade learning to navigate a reality that had been constructed around lies and manipulation. Helen was helped into an ambulance with the gentle care reserved for fragile mental health patients, while Maya clung to Ethan's hand, as if physical contact could bridge the gap that 10 years of separation had created between them. But it was Lily's reaction that would haunt everyone present for years to come. As Julian was led away in custody, she broke free from the social worker assigned to her care and ran after him, calling for her daddy with the heartbroken desperation of a child whose world was being destroyed by adults she didn't understand. The sound of her voice echoing across the mansion's grounds served as a final, devastating reminder that liberation and rescue were not always the same thing, and that some prisons were built from love rather than hatred, making them infinitely more difficult to escape. The Riverside Treatment Center stood like a beacon of hope against the gray November sky, its modern glass facade and carefully landscaped grounds designed to project serenity and healing to the broken souls who sought refuge within its walls. The facility specialized in trauma recovery for victims of prolonged captivity and psychological manipulation, making it one of the few places in the country equipped to handle the complex needs of the Price family. Ethan sat in the visitor parking lot, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he gathered the courage for another day of navigating the delicate process of reconnecting with family members who had become strangers during their decade of enforced separation. The first floor of the treatment center housed the common areas where patients and their families could interact under the watchful supervision of trained professionals. Soft, natural lighting filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating comfortable seating areas arranged to encourage conversation, while providing easy escape routes for those who might become overwhelmed by social interaction. The walls were painted in calming earth tones and decorated with nature photography that suggested peace and stability, a stark contrast to the emotional turbulence that characterized most of the interactions that took place within these carefully designed spaces. Helen's recovery had progressed with encouraging consistency over the 6 weeks since her rescue from Julian's mansion. The woman who had once been the vibrant heart of the Price family was slowly emerging from the fog of confusion and controlled dependency that had defined her existence for the past decade. Her sessions with Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the center's leading expert in deprogramming cult survivors, had begun to restore her connection to memories that Julian's patient manipulation had buried beneath layers of manufactured experiences and artificial contentment. During their supervised visits, Ethan could see glimmers of the mother he remembered flickering behind Helen's cautious expressions, like candlelight struggling against a persistent wind. She would study his face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle, occasionally reaching out to touch his hand, as if physical contact might unlock the emotional connections that psychological trauma had severed. Her speech was often halting and uncertain, punctuated by long pauses where she seemed to be consulting some internal compass to determine whether the thoughts forming in her mind were genuine memories or implanted suggestions. The journals Helen had begun keeping at Dr. Martinez's suggestion revealed the gradual process of distinguishing between her authentic experiences and the false memories that Julian had so skillfully woven into her consciousness. Pages filled with her careful handwriting documented the daily struggle of a woman trying to reclaim her own identity from the maze of lies and half-truths that had defined her existence for years. Some entries celebrated small victories, moments when real memories surfaced with startling clarity, while others recorded the frustration and despair of discovering that experiences she had believed to be genuine were nothing more than Julian's psychological constructions. Maya's healing journey followed a different trajectory, marked by the fierce determination of someone who had spent years fighting to preserve her sense of self against overwhelming psychological pressure. Her therapy sessions with Dr. James Chen focused on processing the guilt and rage that had accumulated during her decade of resistance, emotions that had been forced underground by the necessity of maintaining the facade that kept her family safe from Julian's more extreme forms of control. The young woman who emerged from these sessions was simultaneously stronger and more fragile than the teenager who had disappeared 10 years earlier. Maya had developed survival skills that served her well in navigating the complex process of readjustment to the outside world. But those same skills sometimes made it difficult for her to trust the genuine care and support that surrounded her at the treatment center. She approached each interaction with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that safety was always temporary, and that any display of authentic emotion could be used as a weapon against those she loved. During their private conversations, Maya would share fragments of the psychological warfare she had endured, describing Julian's sophisticated methods of breaking down resistance through a combination of isolation, dependency, and the constant threat of harm to other family members. She had learned to read his moods with the precision of a meteorologist tracking dangerous storms, understanding that her ability to anticipate his emotional state could mean the difference between peace and punishment for her mother and sister. But it was Lily's situation that presented the greatest challenge to the treatment team and the source of Ethan's deepest heartbreak. The 17-year-old who had been rescued from Julian's mansion bore little resemblance to the 7-year-old sister who lived in Ethan's memories, and the decade of psychological conditioning she had undergone had created a person whose entire identity was built on foundations of carefully constructed lies. Her therapy sessions with Dr. Sarah Kim were conducted with the delicate precision of archaeological excavation, attempting to uncover authentic memories buried beneath years of manufactured experiences without causing psychological collapse. Lily's room at the treatment center was decorated with items that reflected the person Julian had shaped her to become. Academic achievement awards from the private tutors he had provided, photographs of family celebrations that had been staged to reinforce her false memories, and personal belongings that connected her to an identity that existed only within the walls of her former prison. She moved through the facility with the cautious grace of someone navigating a foreign country, politely interacting with staff and other patients while maintaining the emotional distance of someone who believed she was being held against her will. The breakthrough moment that Dr. Kim had been working toward came during Lily's 7th week at the facility, triggered by a seemingly innocuous incident in the common room. Ethan had been visiting with Maya when Lily entered the space, drawn by the sound of laughter that reminded her of something she couldn't quite identify. As she approached their table, Maya had instinctively reached out to include her younger sister in their conversation, using a childhood nickname that had been forbidden during their years of captivity. The effect was immediate and devastating. Lily's carefully maintained composure cracked like ice under pressure, and for a moment, the authentic child who had been buried beneath years of conditioning struggled to the surface. But the moment of recognition was followed immediately by a wave of terror and confusion that sent her fleeing from the room, leaving Ethan and Maya to grapple with the realization that recovery would be far more complex than they had imagined. The confrontation that followed took place in Dr. Kim's office, a neutral space designed to provide safety and support during difficult conversations. Lily sat rigidly in her chair, her posture defensive and her eyes filled with the kind of righteous anger that comes from believing oneself to be the victim of a terrible injustice. Her accusations came in a torrent of emotion that had been building since her rescue. each word designed to wound the man she saw as the architect of her family's destruction. Ethan absorbed her anger like a sponge soaking up poison, understanding that her rage was the product of years of psychological manipulation, but feeling each accusation like a physical blow nonetheless. Lily's voice carried the conviction of absolute certainty, as she described Julian not as a captor, but as a loving father who had protected them from a dangerous world, a man whose only crime had been caring too much about their safety and happiness. The most devastating moment came when Lily looked directly into Ethan's eyes and asked why he had destroyed the only family she had ever known, her voice breaking with the genuine grief of someone mourning the loss of everything that had given her life meaning and purpose. The question hung in the air between them like a poisoned arrow, impossible to answer without acknowledging the terrible success of Julian's decade-long campaign to erase Ethan from his sister's heart and mind. Dr. Kim's gentle intervention prevented the conversation from spiraling into complete emotional chaos, but the damage had been done. Lily's retreat into hostile silence marked the beginning of what would prove to be the longest and most difficult phase of the family's recovery process. The psychological walls that Julian had constructed around her authentic memories were proving more resilient than anyone had anticipated, reinforced by a teenager's natural resistance to authority and complicated by the genuine affection she felt for the man who had stolen her childhood. The weeks that followed were marked by a series of small battles and minor victories, each one representing a step forward or backward in the complex process of helping Lily distinguish between the manufactured reality of her captivity and the authentic memories of her early childhood. Her therapy sessions became exercises in archaeological precision, with Dr. Kim carefully excavating layers of false memories while trying to preserve the fragile authentic experiences that might serve as anchors for her true identity. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against Julian moved forward with the relentless momentum of the federal justice system. Prosecutors had built a case that encompassed not only the kidnapping of the Price family, but also the vast financial crimes that had provided the resources for Julian's elaborate deception. The evidence room contained boxes of documents that told the story of a criminal enterprise that had operated for over a decade, touching hundreds of lives and stealing millions of dollars from legitimate businesses and individual investors. Ethan found himself called upon to testify not only about his family's disappearance, but also about the psychological impact of Julian's crimes on their victims. Standing in the federal courthouse, surrounded by the formal ceremony of legal proceedings, he struggled to find words that could adequately convey the scope of damage that had been inflicted, not just on his family, but on his own sense of identity and purpose. The most difficult aspect of the legal process was the requirement that Lily also testify about her experiences, a prospect that filled everyone involved with dread, given her continued loyalty to Julian and her inability to recognize the criminal nature of her captivity. Her preparation for testimony became another battleground in the war for her psychological liberation, with prosecutors and defense attorneys each seeking to use her words to support their competing narratives about Julian's motivations and methods. As the trial date approached, Ethan realized that the courtroom would become the final arena where the battle for his family's future would be decided, not just in legal terms, but in the deeper struggle to determine whether love could triumph over the sophisticated psychological manipulation that had defined their lives for the past decade. The outcome would determine not only Julian's fate but also whether the Price family could ever truly be whole again, or whether they would remain forever fractured by the decade of lies that had reshaped their most fundamental relationships. The federal courthouse stood like a monument to justice against the crisp December sky, its neoclassical columns and granite steps worn smooth by decades of defendants, witnesses, and families seeking resolution to their deepest wounds. Inside courtroom 4A, the morning light filtered through tall windows to illuminate what would become the final chapter of the Price family's decade-long nightmare. The gallery was packed with reporters, federal agents, and members of the public who had followed the case through months of pre-trial coverage, all drawn to witness the conclusion of one of the most complex kidnapping and racketeering cases in recent memory. Julian Croft sat at the defense table with the same composed dignity that had characterized his entire public persona, his expensive suit and carefully groomed appearance creating a stark contrast to the orange jumpsuit he wore during transport to and from the county jail. Even in custody, he maintained the bearing of a successful businessman attending an important meeting, rather than a defendant facing multiple life sentences. His attorney, a high-powered criminal defense lawyer from Washington, had built a strategy around portraying Julian as a victim of circumstances who had made desperate choices to protect innocent people from genuine threats. The prosecution's case had been methodically constructed over 8 months of investigation and preparation, with Assistant United States Attorney Rachel Torres leading a team of federal prosecutors who had assembled evidence spanning 2 decades of criminal activity. The boxes of documents recovered from George Price's hiding place had served as the foundation for a conspiracy case that ultimately encompassed 47 defendants across 6 states, revealing a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of local and state government. Helen Price approached the witness stand with the careful steps of someone who had learned to navigate emotional minefields with extreme caution. The past 4 months of intensive therapy had restored much of her cognitive function and emotional stability. But testifying against the man who had controlled every aspect of her life for 10 years required a level of courage that she was still discovering within herself. Her voice trembled slightly as she was sworn in, but her eyes held a clarity and determination that had been absent during her years of captivity. The testimony she provided painted a picture of psychological manipulation so sophisticated and persistent that even experienced law enforcement professionals in the gallery found themselves struggling to comprehend its scope and subtlety. Helen described Julian's patient erosion of her connection to her previous identity, his replacement of authentic memories with manufactured experiences, and the gradual process by which she had been convinced to accept his version of reality as the truth. Her words carried the weight of someone recounting a nightmare from which she was still not entirely certain she had awakened. The most powerful moments of Helen's testimony came when she described the constant state of hypervigilance that had characterized her daily existence, the way she had learned to monitor Julian's moods and anticipate his needs in order to protect her daughters from his displeasure. She spoke of the elaborate performances required to maintain the illusion of their happiness, the way genuine emotions had become dangerous luxuries that could threaten the safety of her family if expressed at the wrong moment or in the wrong manner. Maya's testimony followed 3 days later, and her appearance on the witness stand marked a dramatic contrast to her mother's hesitant delivery. The young woman who had spent years secretly resisting Julian's psychological control possessed a steely determination that transformed the courtroom into a battlefield, where she finally had the opportunity to speak truth to power. Her voice remained steady as she described the constant mental warfare that had defined her adolescence and young adulthood, the way she had been forced to choose between preserving her sanity and protecting her family. The details Maya provided about Julian's methods of control were so specific and disturbing that several jurors visibly recoiled as she described the punishment system he had implemented to maintain order within his artificial family structure. She spoke of the subtle psychological techniques he used to create dependency and compliance, the way he had positioned himself as both protector and potential threat, making resistance feel not only futile but actively dangerous to the people she loved most. But it was Maya's description of her relationship with Lily that provided the most devastating testimony about the long-term impact of Julian's crimes. She detailed the heartbreak of watching her younger sister gradually lose connection to her authentic memories, the way Julian had systematically replaced Lily's real family relationships with manufactured attachments that served his psychological needs. Her voice broke only once during her testimony, when she described the moment she realized that Lily no longer remembered their father's face or the sound of his voice. The courtroom fell into complete silence when Lily was called to testify. Her appearance on the witness stand representing the culmination of months of preparation and psychological support, designed to help her navigate the complex process of distinguishing between her authentic experiences and the false memories that Julian had so carefully constructed. At 17, she possessed the physical presence of a young woman, but carried herself with the uncertain posture of someone whose sense of identity remained fundamentally unstable. Dr. Sarah Kim had prepared extensively for this moment, working with Lily to identify specific memories that could serve as anchors to reality during what would inevitably be a traumatic experience. The testimony that emerged was fragmented and sometimes contradictory, reflecting the ongoing battle between the false narrative Julian had implanted and the authentic memories that were slowly being recovered through intensive therapy. Lily's voice was barely audible as she described her confusion about her own identity and her struggle to understand why the man she had believed to be her father was now being described as a criminal. The most heartbreaking aspect of Lily's testimony was her visible confusion and distress as she attempted to reconcile the competing versions of reality that existed within her mind. She spoke hesitantly about fragments of memory that seemed to contradict the story Julian had told her about their family's history. but her words were punctuated by long pauses as she struggled to determine which experiences were genuine and which had been artificially implanted through years of patient manipulation. Julian's reaction to his family's testimony was carefully controlled but unmistakably emotional, his composed facade finally showing cracks as he listened to their descriptions of the psychological damage his actions had inflicted. His attorney's objections became increasingly desperate as the weight of evidence mounted, but the documentation recovered from George Price's hiding place provided corroboration for every major element of the family's account of their captivity. The financial crimes portion of the trial revealed the broader context of Julian's criminal enterprise, showing how his legitimate businesses had served as fronts for money laundering operations that had processed over $40 million in proceeds from various illegal activities. Federal agents testified about discovering sophisticated accounting systems that had been designed to hide the movement of money through dozens of shell companies and offshore accounts, creating a paper trail that stretched across 3 continents and involved hundreds of unwitting accomplices. The testimony from George Price's former business associates painted a picture of a man who had become increasingly desperate to extricate himself from Julian's criminal network in the months before his family's disappearance. Several witnesses described George's growing paranoia and his attempts to gather evidence that could be used to expose the full scope of Julian's operations. Their accounts provided crucial context for understanding why Julian had felt compelled to take such extreme measures to prevent George from testifying before the federal grand jury. The defense's strategy centered on portraying Julian as a broken man whose judgment had been compromised by the trauma of losing his own family to criminal violence. Character witnesses testified about his legitimate charitable activities and his reputation as a successful businessman, while psychological experts attempted to explain his actions as the desperate choices of someone suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. But the overwhelming evidence of systematic psychological manipulation and financial crimes made it impossible to present Julian as simply a victim of circumstances. The jury deliberated for 6 days before returning with guilty verdicts on all 43 counts, including kidnapping, money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy charges that carried sentences totaling over 200 years in federal prison. Julian's reaction to the verdict was the first crack in his composed facade that had been visible throughout the trial, his shoulders sagging slightly as the weight of his crimes and their consequences finally registered with devastating finality. The sentencing hearing took place 3 months later, providing the Price family with one final opportunity to address the man who had stolen a decade of their lives, while believing he was protecting them from a dangerous world. Helen spoke first, her voice stronger than it had been during her trial testimony, describing the ongoing process of rebuilding her sense of identity and her determination to help her daughters heal from the trauma Julian had inflicted upon them. Maya's victim impact statement was delivered with the fierce determination of someone who had finally found her voice after years of enforced silence. She looked directly at Julian as she spoke, describing the ongoing challenges she faced in learning to trust her own perceptions and emotions after years of having them manipulated and controlled. But her words also carried a note of triumph, acknowledging that his power over her family had finally been broken and that they were beginning the long process of recovery. Lily's statement was brief and uncertain, reflecting her ongoing struggle to understand the full scope of what had been done to her during her years of captivity. She spoke haltingly about her confusion and anger, but also about the small moments of clarity that had begun to emerge as her authentic memories slowly surfaced through therapy. Her words carried the weight of someone grieving the loss of a false reality that had nevertheless provided her with a sense of security and belonging. The return to their childhood home came 6 months after Julian's sentencing, marking the beginning of what Dr. Martinez described as the final phase of their recovery process. The house had been meticulously restored by a team of contractors who had worked to erase any evidence of the crime scene it had once been. But the emotional resonance of the space remained complex and challenging for each family member to navigate in their own way. The living room where they had once gathered for holiday celebrations and family discussions had been repainted and refurnished, but the memories embedded in its walls seemed to shimmer between past and present, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Helen moved through the familiar spaces with the careful attention of someone relearning a foreign language, touching surfaces and examining objects as if they might hold the key to unlocking the parts of her identity that remained frustratingly elusive. Maya chose to redecorate her childhood bedroom completely, removing every trace of the teenager she had been before their family's disappearance, and creating a space that reflected the woman she had become through trauma and survival. The process of selecting new furniture and artwork became a form of therapy in itself, each decision representing another step toward reclaiming her authentic sense of self from the psychological prison Julian had constructed around her developing identity. But it was Lily's relationship with the house that proved most complex and emotionally charged. The 17-year-old who returned home bore little resemblance to the 7-year-old who had left, and her memories of their shared spaces remained fragmented and unreliable. She moved through the rooms like a tourist visiting a museum dedicated to someone else's childhood, occasionally pausing when some small detail triggered a fragment of authentic memory that felt both familiar and impossibly distant. The fireplace and its chimney, once the repository of deadly secrets, had been transformed into something approaching a shrine to truth and family resilience. The bricks that had concealed George Price's desperate warning had been carefully restored, but a small plaque now marked the location where his hidden message had finally been discovered. The inscription was simple but profound, acknowledging both the pain of their separation and the hope of their eventual reunion. Winter evenings found the family gathered in their living room with a tentative approximation of their old routine, though the conversations were often halting and careful, punctuated by long silences as each of them processed the complex emotions of being together again. Helen would work on the crossword puzzles that had once been her favorite pastime, occasionally asking for help with clues that seemed to test her recovering memory as much as her vocabulary. Maya had enrolled in graduate school, pursuing a degree in psychology with a specialization in trauma recovery that reflected her determination to transform her own suffering into a tool for helping other survivors. Her textbooks lay scattered across the coffee table, alongside her mother's puzzle books and Lily's homework assignments, creating a tableau of 3 generations of women working to rebuild their lives from the foundation up. Lily's progress remained the most uncertain and emotionally fraught aspect of their family's recovery. Some days brought breakthrough moments when authentic memories surfaced with startling clarity, allowing her to connect with experiences and emotions from her early childhood that Julian's manipulation had buried beneath layers of manufactured experiences. Other days found her withdrawn and confused, struggling with the cognitive dissonance of trying to reconcile multiple versions of her own history. The therapy sessions that continued for all 3 women served as a kind of archaeological expedition into their shared and individual trauma, with trained professionals helping them excavate authentic experiences from beneath the debris of psychological manipulation and enforced dependency. Progress was measured not in dramatic revelations, but in small moments of clarity and connection, gradual improvements in their ability to trust their own perceptions and emotions. Dr. Martinez had warned them that recovery from such systematic psychological abuse would be a process measured in years, rather than months, with setbacks and challenges that would test their determination to reclaim their authentic selves from the elaborate fiction Julian had constructed around their lives. But she had also emphasized the remarkable resilience they had already demonstrated, and their growing capacity to support each other through the ongoing challenges of rebuilding their family relationships. As spring arrived and brought with it the promise of renewal and growth, the Price family found themselves slowly adapting to the rhythm of a life that was simultaneously familiar and entirely new. They were not the same people who had been separated 10 years earlier, nor could they ever fully return to the innocence and simplicity of their previous existence. But in their carefully rebuilt home, surrounded by the evidence of their survival and the growing strength of their reconnection, they had begun to discover that healing was possible even after the most devastating betrayal of trust, and that love could eventually triumph over even the most sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.